Hi, and thanks for watching this message video, and don't forget to go through the life lesson that goes with it. And for those who can't make a Sunday, don't forget that there is a podcast of that sermon that goes along with this message video and life lesson. Today we're continuing on in our series called What the What, where we're learning through different stories in the Bible that God can be trusted even though things may not make sense or even when things are scary. So today we're going to go through the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Nebuchadnezzar, and then on Sunday a little bit more of Daniel. For those who don't know who Nebuchadnezzar is, he is the king of Babylon that God used to destroy all of Jerusalem and take the Israelites as well as the people of Judah into captivity as slaves. And the reason that we're told that God did this is because he was using Nebuchadnezzar to essentially execute judgment against the Israelites, his wayward children, because of their rebellion. But Nebuchadnezzar didn't see it that way. Like a true narcissist, he believed that all of those accomplishments were because of his own strength and might and power, and therefore he deserved worship for it, and so he decided to do this. Daniel 3, 1 through 6. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he sent messages to the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. So all these officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald shouted out, "People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow down to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." When it comes to dealing with a narcissist, that can be a very hard thing to do and very, very taxing. But for all the people who are a part of the kingdom of Babylon at this point in time, I'm sure that when it came to the option of being barbecued, that they figured out a way to deal with this what the what kind of moment and move forward. But when it came to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, this was a clear violation from Yahweh, their God, which they were told not to worship any other gods but him. So they were faced themselves with a real what the what moment and a decision that ultimately was going to make all the difference in the world about this story. Here's what we're told happened next. Daniel 3, 7 through 12. So at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king! You issued a decree requiring all people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up." From the way things appear, these astrologers may have had ulterior motives when it came to snitching on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they may have been trying to perhaps promote themselves by making themselves look more worshipful than somebody else was. But nonetheless, something that we can learn from all of this is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were obviously targeted because of their beliefs. And this is something as Christians that we can learn from, that as followers of Christ, we should assume that our beliefs will make us a target to some. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were prepared for this. And so here's what we're told happened next. Daniel 3, 13 through 18. Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up?" I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace, and then what god will be able to rescue you from my power?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." I want everybody to notice that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't come into Nebuchadnezzar's presence with sarcasm or swagger or bravado. No, they came in with deep respect, referring to him as your majesty. But they were also very clear that there was no way that they were ever going to worship the gold statue or any of the gods that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And everybody saw this. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar saw this. All of his officials saw this. But most importantly, God saw this. As a result, what happens next may be a series of some of the most serious what-the-what moments that Nebuchadnezzar ever experienced in his life, not to mention all the people who were around him. Here's what we're told happened. Daniel 3:19 through 27. Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king in his anger had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. But suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men unbound walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god." Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out! Come here!" So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not even a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. To be a part of a story like this, we have to have faith, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that is fully secure, fully developed. But think about all that happened to these guys in order to develop their faith, to be a part of a great what-the-what moment like this. You see, not only had they lost everything important to them in terms of family and home and land and possessions, but now these guys were displaced as slaves, living as captives. Yet, in spite of their losses, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stayed focused on the 2 most important things in life, to enjoy God and to glorify Him. And because of that faith, God was able to use these guys to help Nebuchadnezzar, one of the biggest narcissists that the planet has ever seen, not to mention his officials, see God in a whole new way. In fact, here's what we're told happened next. Daniel 3:28 through 30. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions in the province of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar was a true narcissist, and unfortunately, many of us have had to deal with people like that. In other words, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Some of us have had to deal with 90-foot egos and still somehow, some way be polite and kind and honoring, which is the right thing to do. But because of their faith and because of this consistency of honoring on their part, God was able to use them to honestly rock one of the biggest narcissists on the planet. And all of this, again, was because of an attitude that they possessed and that they understood the two most important things, which is to glorify God, obviously, but first and foremost, to enjoy a relationship with Him. So this is obviously a lesson to all of us in that for God to rock someone's world like He did with Nebuchadnezzar, we might have to take bold risks with our lives like what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. And like I mentioned earlier, these guys weren't the only ones who were taking bold risks for God through being faithful and being honoring. In fact, Daniel was another one who did that, and I'll be talking a little bit more about him on Sunday, and I hope you can join me.